Hi everyone, my name is Bobby. I am one of the Adjudication Core for NSDC 2020, and I'll be presenting the post-debate analysis for round 4 of the tournament. All right, so the motion that we have is this House believes that nations with a Muslim majority population should normalize relationship with Israel. So this is a very heavy topic talking about international relations. So there are a couple of key area questions that teams can argue about in the round. So the first area is about what's happening in the status quo and whether or not there is an inherent necessity for normalization. The second question is about what are the interests of Muslim majority countries and whether or not doing this policy necessarily aligns with their values and with their ideology and all of the internal politics that happen within them. And finally, obviously, the practical element of the debate, whether or not doing this would necessarily generate better outcomes. So let's dissect these area questions one by one. All right, so the first question about what's happening in status quo and whether or not there is a necessity for normalization. So here are a couple of things that you can argue from both government and opposition. So let's take a look at the government case first. So what we need to recognize is that Israel, despite being a very young country, they only existed for the past 70 years, has become a very formidable nation in the Middle East. They have one of the strongest economy. They're one of the very few democracies that exist within the region. And we believe that it would be very good if we were to establish a relationship with them because they would be a formidable ally that we can depend on. So why do we need to have them as allies, right? Obviously, as Muslim majority nations, when it comes to issues of Israel, Palestine would always come to mind, right? Like, what would happen to the Palestinians? So we need to recognize currently that the lives of Palestinians are getting worse by the day. And we recognize this is happening because Israel keeps on annexing parts of Palestine. The remaining areas are currently West Bank and Gaza. So that obviously begs a big question, right? If Israel is already doing bad things to Palestine, why on earth should we endorse them? Why on earth should we be friends with a country that is, inherently doing evil stuff towards a party that is vulnerable? So what we need to recognize is that Israel's annexation isn't just out of the blue. It isn't a random action. The reason why they're doing that is because the government of Israel, particularly the right wing or the conservative spectrum of the politics, is the one that keeps on using nationalistic sentiments in order for them to get support by the Israeli people and therefore maintain their power as the government of Israel. The nationalistic sentiments that they keep saying is that the world is against us. And therefore, we need to do everything in our power to make sure that this region works for us. We need to be able to retaliate back. And that's why annexation happens because they feel that they are basically reclaiming their right to land and things like that. And so this is basically influenced by the right-wing conservatives. Now, what happens then if we were to normalize is that it gives Benjamin Netanyahu, the current prime minister of Israel, a reason to stop being very aggressive to Palestinian. And a really good precedent that we can use is actually the fact that when Bahrain and the United Arab Emirates decides to enter into agreement with Israel and United States in normalizing their relationship, they pushed for a condition to be met, which is the idea that now Israel needs to stop its annexation efforts. And this is something that Israel happily agreed to because now they no longer need to prove to their constituents that the world is against them. Now they're able to create, economic and diplomatic allies within the region. And so that's why we think that if the Muslim majority countries were to follow in their footsteps, we can utilize this as more leverage, to make Israel a more moderate country in that regard. So that's the possible context that the government team can talk about in this debate. Now let's take a look at the opposition approach. What would most likely be their case? So the opposition can argue that normalization becomes extremely unnecessary because moderation in Israel will happen organically. So an important context to note here is that Benjamin Netanyahu, while he is the current prime minister of Israel, he doesn't enjoy the massive support that his Likud party has enjoyed in previous years, because a lot of the Israeli population just grew exhausted of the constant conflict, of all of this wars, that they keep on fighting against each other. People get fatigue and exhaustion from all of that. And this is the reason why the Israeli people had an election before, and Benjamin Netanyahu's Likud party was not as dominating as before. It got to the point where, in order for Benjamin Netanyahu to form a government, he needed to build a coalition with the Blue and White Party. Now, this is the important context, because the Blue and White Party is a party that is more centrist, a party that's more moderate, not necessarily conservative, but also not necessarily liberal. Now, an important part that we need to understand about this coalition is that there was a deal made, which is that it's the concept of power sharing. Given that Likud party basically needs blue and white in order to rule, this is where the blue and white party decides to exert some influence and made some negotiations in saying that after 18 months, past the election, which happened earlier in April 2020, Netanyahu will step down as prime minister, and Benny Gantz, which is the leader of the Blue and White Party, is going to rise and take his place as the alternative prime minister. Now, this context is critical because given that Benny Gantz is more centrist, more moderate, it would be easier then for the Muslim-majority countries to then assert pressure on stopping annexation once Gantz is in power. And Gantz isn't particularly very keen on annexation either, because he also feels that that is a bad idea to happen. Now, even if, let's say, that you don't know all of these contexts, that it doesn't fall through, you can still argue the idea that Muslim-majority nations are better positioned to exert pressure and influence by being a fierce critic of Israel rather than being an ally, because we need to ensure that we maintain a consistency of our principle and also minimizing harmful compromises. Because what happened in the Bahrain and UAE agreement, it is a coincidence that the outcome of that negotiation was quite favorable. But this would not necessarily be the same when other Muslim-majority nations were to normalize their relationship with Israel. And given that fact, because we don't know what the compromise is going to look like, we would rather err on the side of caution. So those are the things that opposition can bring in this first area of discussion. All right, the second part is, what are the interests of the Muslim-majority nations, and does this policy align with their values? So let's talk about the government's case first. So in terms of the case, security-wise, we need to acknowledge that Israel has one of the most sophisticated military technological advancement in the world. Not only that they're manufacturing a lot of these amazing defense infrastructure, but also their intelligence gathering is extremely valuable. And when we talk about Muslim-majority nations, we are currently facing a lot of security issues, and that's why being able to access a lot of these defense infrastructures, a lot of these weaponries, and security apparatus, and obviously getting useful intel would be very helpful in us upholding our national security. So what are a couple of contexts that we can talk about? For instance, you can talk about something close to home, which is Indonesia and Malaysia. Indonesia and Malaysia used to be revered as one of the most tolerant Muslim-majority population countries, but in recent years, studies have shown that there is a rising extremism where even there are homegrown terrorists that are very much inspired by the extremist groups in the Middle East. And we think that it's important because we need to tackle this. This is a legitimate security threat for our country. Now, Israel has many intel on terrorist organizations. They know about the kinds of networks and a lot of the important security details, which would be very helpful again for these countries. Additionally, when we talk about having more weapons and defense infrastructures, we need to be cognizant of a lot of the geopolitical realities. For instance, for Indonesia and Malaysia, we are currently facing a threat of Chinese incursion towards our region, with the fact that China is currently trying to claim the South China Sea, and positioning their militaries there. As Indonesia and Malaysia, and also to some extent Brunei, we need to make sure that our sovereignty can be protected. And by being allies with Israel, we can achieve our own form of national security without having to depend on a bigger power, i.e., United States or the European Union, for that matter. Finally, the justification for this. So obviously, the controversial part is about we should maintain solidarity when it comes to Palestine and things like that. But it is within our perspective that it is justified for you to normalize your relationship with Israel, because countries have a primary duty to put forward the interest of their country, to put the interest of their citizens. And that's why your foreign policy should also reflect those concerns as well. And that's why when it comes to international relationships, oftentimes ideologies can be put aside because we need to be pragmatic. And a lot of cases has happened, historically, where countries have built on, diplomatic and economic relationship with other countries that are inherently ideologically oppositional to themselves, but because of there are factual realities that we need to take a look at in terms of fulfilling our needs and the kinds of demands that we have in order to function properly, we can put aside our dislike or disagreement in terms of principle. Obviously, as an example, United States is a country that believes in democracy and freedom and liberty, but at the same time, United States is very much buddies with Saudi Arabia, which is the exact antithesis of that. Saudi Arabia does not believe in democracy. It believes in a single autocratic rule of the monarchs. They have gross violation of human rights. But again, that relationship works. And there are just multitudes of examples of other relationships like this. So that's why we don't think that it's a controversial decision for us to take. Now, for the opposition team, what you can argue is a couple of things. In principle, Muslim-majority nations, you have an obligation to maintain solidarity with Palestinian, because we need to remember our history. The way that the state of Israel was formed was basically unjust. They occupied Palestinian land and they encroached it until there was nothing left for the Palestinians except for the West Bank and Gaza. Israel have continuously violated agreement after agreement and after agreement, and this indicates that they are not a dependable ally to count on. How can you ensure that they're able to hold up their end of the bargain if they continuously violate agreements and treaties that they have placed with Palestinians before? So as a principle, like, nations should not associate themselves with despotic regimes that has only done harms to other people. So despite that there might be potential benefits, we also need to weigh that with the kinds of harms that they inflict, right? And there is an argument to be made that our foreign policy doesn't always have to put our country's interest first, because being principled and having a bold stance is more important. An example for this would be how the entire world basically sanctioned South Africa's apartheid regime when, basically South Africa was a semi-military state. They imposed sort of like segregation for people of different race and color, and there was just massive gross violation of human rights. And the entire world sanctioned the heck out of South Africa. And this sanction was only uplifted when finally the discriminative structures of apartheid was finally dismantled in South Africa in the early 1990s. So this definitely shows to you that we need to stand up for a principle. We can't always be pragmatic when it comes to international relations. On the issue of security, so we need to remember as well that if we were to associate with Israel, this would make our country more susceptible to extremism. So the thing with terrorist groups, and the reason why they're so powerful, is that they want to maintain the ideological purity of Islam. And other parties or other entities that they feel is deviating from that element of purity, they'll be retaliated against. As a really good example, ISIS doesn't only attack like Christians, like Westerners and liberals, but they also attack fellow Muslims that they feel are heathens, fellow Muslims who don't practice the pure version of Islam that they feel is the most sort of like the only acceptable definition that exists out there. And so that's why if we were to associate with Israel, this would only further more extreme propaganda. This would only embolden their kinds of recruitment tactic, because now these countries are going to be seen as a complicit, a contributor, an enabler of the Israeli occupation, and we can expect more potential attacks coming from these extreme groups. So actually, even if you were able to get all of the sophisticated military and technological advancement and intel, like what the government said, it's not going to be useful because now you have given fuel to the fire to these extremist organizations, and that's why we think that's particularly bad. Finally, the last area of question and debate would be on whether or not the policy would generate better outcomes. So there are three sort of like benefits and harms that you can argue about, both in government and opposition. So the first thing that the government could argue is that this creates more understanding with each country. Obviously, because when we normalize relationship, it's not just economic trade that's going to happen, but we're also going to have diplomatic exchanges. We're also going to have like sort of a cultural tie, and we can learn from each other. The problem with the current way of non-relationship is that given we don't know a lot about each other, a lot of these information gap is filled with stereotypes, with so much prejudice, and basically faulty generalizations. For instance, many Muslim-majority nations constantly refer to Israel as Zionist, and given the lack of understanding, then they oftentimes equate Christians and Catholics in the same group as Israeli Jews, which is obviously not the case because, you can't just jumble people's identity up just like that, right? Israel then refers to Muslim-majority nations as existential threat for themselves. Now, this obviously has fueled many layers of societal conflict that is based on fear-mongering. If we were to have cultural exchanges, we're able to understand a bit better about each other and therefore reduce that level of societal conflict. The second benefit that you can argue is that now Israel is going to be far more receptive towards our suggestions and also our criticisms on Palestine. And the reason for this is because it comes from a friendly source. This is not some like random mean girl that is making commentaries, but you're an ally now. And you have mutual respect and trust with each other. And so therefore, Israel obviously wants to maintain that kind of relationship with you. And that's the reason why they're more likely to listen to all of the things that you have said. The example of UAE and Bahrain being able to influence the policy of annexation of Netanyahu indicates that they are indeed willing to negotiate and compromise in that regard. The third thing is that the entry to holy sites in Jerusalem, like Masjid al-Aqsa and all of the other holy sites, now becomes available for Muslims and who would want to exercise their pilgrimage. They now have the ability to reconnect with the rich history that the country has to offer. This has always been difficult for people because, for example, many Muslim-majority nations, their passports don't recognize Israel, and therefore they're not being allowed to travel to Jerusalem. Even if they do, it would be extremely difficult and expensive. We think that giving people the ability to have spiritual fulfillment and understanding about where the religion has developed and a lot of the important sort of like progresses that is being made there, that is a critical benefit that we would get on the government side. Now let's take a look at the potential cases for the opposition. So the first thing that we would talk about is obviously this is going to escalate conflicts even further, because if we were to analyze Palestine, Palestine consists of two conflicting factions, which is Hamas and also Fatah. So Hamas is the extreme wing of Palestine, who basically, the way that they govern and address the Israeli occupation is through violence. They constantly engage in war with the Israeli Defense Forces. Now, Hamas has already expressed their massive disapproval on UAE and Bahrain normalizing relationship, and they've basically called these countries traitors. They've betrayed the trust of the Palestinians. Now, this might fuel more anger in Palestine. And we need to make sure that Fatah, which is the more moderate faction, that they remain in power, right? Because if Hamas were to gain momentum, they now have the ability to then influence people in wanting to initiate a third intifada. And if we've learned from history, the first and second intifada has only killed more Palestinians, and has not resulted in any meaningful sort of like reforms when it comes to creating a two-state solution of Israel and Palestine. We need to make sure that the unity between the West Bank and the Gaza Strip must remain, because these are the only sort of like assets and home that the Palestinians currently have. The second harm that would happen is that Israel now no longer has incentive to moderate, because now they have the friendship of Muslim majority nations. So exactly, because we're withholding our relationship, that becomes our leverage, right? Now, if the prop case is true, that Israel is just so powerful that they have all of these like security and military technological advancement, then the relationship would most likely be asymmetrical in that sense, that more of these Muslim majority countries are going to be dependent on Israel, but not vice versa. And so therefore, given that the relationship is not balanced in terms of the power dynamics, then the diplomatic pressure is simply not just going to be that effective, and therefore it's not going to generate any better outcomes. But finally, when we recognize Israel, that would also mean that we acknowledge Jerusalem belonging to them as opposed to the Palestinians. Now, legitimizing that contentious claim erases a lot of the cultural history that the Palestinians have with the city. That's why we should avoid taking sides when it comes to this, because you've already have the United States legitimizing Jerusalem being part of Israel. We should not also engage in that kind of problematic behavior, because the Palestinians are still fighting for their claim of Jerusalem as well. All right, so those are the things that you can argue from opposition. This is basically the end of the PDA. Just a reminder that what we've talked about in this presentation aren't the only things that you can discuss. Obviously, there's more areas to be talked about, especially in IR motions. So if you didn't bring any of these arguments, that doesn't mean that your case was bad. It might actually be much better than what we have. But these are just some of the thoughts that we had when we were constructing the arguments for the motion. All right, that is the end of the PDA. I wish everyone the best of luck.